You sit down to do the hardest task of your week. A quiet room, no distractions, the laptop open, the document waiting. 5 minutes in, you cannot think. The silence is loud. Your mind is somehow both blank and racing. So you do the thing that, on paper, makes no sense. You put on a coffee shop ambience track. You queue up a podcast you're not actually going to listen to. You go work in an actual coffee shop, full of strangers having actual conversations. And suddenly, with all that noise around you, the work just starts. If you focus better, with music in your ears, with chatter in the background, with a TV on in another room, with the gentle white noise of a busy environment around you, your psychology is doing something very specific. And it is not what every productivity article on the internet has been telling you. The people who need noise to think are not undisciplined. They do not have broken attention. They are running a cognitive system that uses ambient stimulation as fuel, and that system, when it's allowed to run the way it was built to run, is one of the more underrated minds a person can carry. Here's the thing nobody talks about. The mainstream story about focus says the same thing on every productivity blog. Eliminate distractions, find a quiet space, put your phone in another room, close the door. That advice is built on the assumption that the brain is a clean machine that gets disrupted by noise. For most people, this is roughly accurate. Cut the noise, free the focus. But for some brains, silence is not the absence of distraction. It is its own form of distraction. When the room goes quiet, the inner voice gets loud. Random worries surface. The unfinished email from 3 weeks ago suddenly demands attention. Your mind, deprived of mid-level external stimulation, generates its own. And that internally generated noise is harder to ignore than the noise of a coffee shop because it doesn't have an off button. Some brains, in other words, were not built for the library. They were built for the cafe, the workshop, the busy kitchen, the open studio. The mistake wasn't yours. The mistake was assuming everyone's brain runs the same operating system. In the 1950s, psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson formalized what's now called the Yerkes-Dodson law. Their research showed that performance on cognitive tasks follows an inverted U-shape relative to arousal. Too little stimulation, and the brain is sluggish. Too much, and the brain is overwhelmed. Peak performance lives in the middle. The catch is that the middle is not the same place for everyone. For some people, peak focus arrives at low arousal. For others, peak focus requires significantly more. More recent work in attention research, including studies on what's sometimes called the optimal stimulation level, has documented this pattern in detail. Some brains arrive at the desk already understimulated. They need ambient input to rise into the focus zone. This is why a child with attention difficulties can sometimes complete an entire homework assignment in a chaotic kitchen and not a single page in a silent bedroom. The kitchen is not distracting them. The kitchen is regulating them. Picture this. You're trying to write something difficult. You're at home. The room is silent. You sit at the desk. 2 minutes pass. You stand up. You make tea. You sit back down. You stare at the cursor blinking on the page. You move to the couch. You move back to the desk. You read the same sentence you wrote 40 minutes ago. Nothing is moving. Then, almost as a joke, you open a streaming service and put on a movie you've already seen 3 times, just for the noise. You set it to a low volume. You go back to the document, and within a minute, the words are arriving. The page is filling. 40 minutes later, you've done the work that the silent room couldn't pull out of you. You did not need to focus harder. You needed the right kind of noise to be there in the background, anchoring something the silence kept letting drift. But here's where it gets interesting. Brains that need noise to think tend to be unusually associative. You're not failing to focus. You're processing more inputs than the average brain does, in parallel, and you've trained yourself to channel that processing into the task in front of you when there's enough ambient signal to absorb the spillover. The noise isn't competing with your work. It's catching the bandwidth that would otherwise loop on internal thoughts. People with narrower attention bandwidth find this counterintuitive. Yours has always worked this way, but there's more going on than just bandwidth. People who need noise to think tend to do their best work in environments most productivity gurus would call distracting. Cafes, open studios, trains, airports, busy living rooms. There's a long tradition of writers, designers, and engineers who simply do not produce in quiet spaces. J.K. Rowling famously wrote much of Harry Potter in busy cafes. Many software engineers code best with music. The pattern is not that they can tolerate distraction. The pattern is that they require ambient stimulation to access their own concentration in the first place. And here's the kicker. This cognitive style often correlates with a specific kind of creativity. Brains that pull in ambient signal tend to make unexpected connections because they are constantly cross-referencing what they're working on against everything else they're absorbing. The conversation at the next table sparks the metaphor you were missing. The lyric in the background unlocks the structural shift in your project. The half-watched movie reminds you of something the work needed. This isn't a coincidence. Associative thinkers feed on the input, and this shows up in ways you might not even notice. People who need noise to think tend to also need movement, conversation, and variety. You probably think best on walks. You probably solve problems while talking out loud. You probably had your best ideas in the shower, in the car, in any environment that wasn't a desk. You are not someone who underperforms in silence because you lack discipline. You are someone whose cognition was built to run on motion and input. The desk in the silent room is the only environment in which you were ever asked to be your worst self. Now let's be honest, there is a real cost to this. People who need noise to think are often misread, especially in classroom and office settings, as undisciplined or distractible. They've been told their whole lives that they should be able to focus in silence like everyone else, and they've internalized the failure to do so as a personal defect. The trait can also tip into avoidance, where the noise becomes a way to never actually sit with a hard task. Knowing your brain is not the same as letting it run unchecked. Both can be true. But for the people who learn to design environments around how their cognition actually works, here's what you actually carry. You have a mind that's built for input, motion, and association. You can do creative work in places where most people would freeze. You can make connections most people miss because you're processing more signal at once. You can think out loud, work in motion, and concentrate inside the kind of ambient chaos most productivity advice tells you to escape. The work isn't to learn to focus in silence. The work is to stop apologizing for how your brain has always worked and to build the environments that let it work the way it was built to. There's something quietly remarkable about people who need noise to think. They tend to be the ones who get their best ideas in the most unlikely places. The crowded restaurant, the drive home, the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. They've spent their whole lives being told to find a quiet corner and concentrate, and they've spent their whole lives discovering again and again that the quiet corner was the one place where nothing happened. If you have spent years feeling vaguely guilty that you can't seem to focus the way the world tells you to focus, this might be the moment to consider that the focus was never the problem. The room was. Your brain was waiting for the right kind of input, and when it found it, it always knew exactly what to do. You're not distractible. You're not undisciplined. You're not bad at focus. You're someone whose cognition runs on input and who has been trying to do real work in environments that were never built for the way your mind actually thinks. If you nodded through any part of this, you're the reason silent awareness exists. Hit subscribe to get the next deep dive when it lands, and turn on the bell so it doesn't disappear in your feed. Every subscribe genuinely matters to a small channel like this one,